Hello and welcome to MySecurityTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Friday morning episode. We're going to be joined once again by Dr Chris Flaherty from My Space Warfare Analysis Lab, and we're going to be looking at the space tourism sector. We've had a couple of billionaires head up into space very recently. You would have heard that in the mainstream media. But we'll have a look at where the space sector and the space tourism sector is actually going. Dr. Chris Flaherty, how are you?
Not too bad. That was actually a really interesting. That was a great interview.
Oh, thank you very much. I just asked the questions. Andy's obviously very interesting CEO, and sorry we went slightly over time.
I think it's interesting because I think we've talked about this before. One of the major growth industries potentially is actually companies who collect information to package up and sell.
Absolutely.
And I think we're sort of concentrating on space industry. We're going to be looking at space tourism, but we're concentrating on launching satellites, building the fixed infrastructure, which is going to be crucial. But the issue about, Virgin Orbit is actually in the position now soon will be in position having a second stage on their rocket, which they launch horizontally from a 747, that'll actually take missions to basically create the opportunities for planetary probes to Mars, Jupiter, Mars and Venus, and the satellites. And the interesting thing about that is companies will actually be sending up probes and satellites to other planets in our solar system, because people will be interested in the data from that, and that becomes an entirely new form of business. And it's interesting to see how it operates on our own planet Earth. But it also means this is probably one of the major growth industries, and I think it's really interesting to keep a close contact on how this is developing.
And it's also I look at it from a business perspective, because the challenge of running a business as well as a public company as Kleos is, there's so many moving parts there. We took even in our own business, we term it, we have planets in orbit. You have to have all of those planets aligning at once to make it actually work. And he's got a lot of plates in the air at any one time. So, it's really impressive.
His satellites, are they under the 500 kilogram category?
They are. Yes. They do 4 at a time, I believe. So
that was very interesting, the idea of coordinated movement between the cluster.
Their scouting mission. Yeah, the scouting mission. Well, look, let's have a chat about space tourism and where that's going. Obviously, they had a lot of mainstream media where we had Virgin Galactic and what was the other one?
And Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin.
That's the one, Blue Origin.
Yep.
So unless you're a billionaire, you haven't had a chance to get up into space. But for some of the figures that you're coming out, we're going to have about 300 odd sort of opportunities a year within the next few years.
Yeah, what we're going to be making available from this talk is a 10-page snapshot, if you like, of the space tourism industry, going back to its actual origins back in 1997, 2004, 2001. And we have to actually remember Mr. Dennis Tito, who was actually a millionaire. If you're going to have millions, why do you need billions? And it goes back. A lot of people seem to forget that the space tourism industry has actually been growing for 20 years now. And there was a hiatus period between 2010 and 2019 due to the end of the space shuttle program and the growing size of missions on the ISS, the International Space Station. But prior to that point, there were about 7 or 8 people that actually already gone and stayed on the space station. NASA has announced again that they'll be allowing private astronauts to go to the space station. That's actually more or less in relation to the Axiom pre-missions in order to start building the Axiom space station. But I think we need to understand that this industry has already generated something in the order of 920 million or 920 million since 2001. And the interesting thing is, if you go back to the early, the original shift back in 1997, 2004, when they originally the issue was how do you detach space from direct government, the necessity for direct government control, because only governments could largely could go into space. They are the only ones who had the resources. Who else was going to do that? And it had to be the extremely wealthy. And I think a lot of people have actually forgotten that the original debate, the economic debate back in the late 90s, early 2000s, was that it was actually having, if you were to launch a private space industry, a commercializing space, it would have to actually, that responsibility, if you like, would have to rest with the extremely wealthy who had the resources on the scale of governments in order to start building space missions, in order to start building about the craft as well. In fact, Virgin Galactic's origins back in 2004 goes back to a prize that was awarded to the original company that built Spaceship One, being the first commercial company to successfully launch into space and then repeat the process 2 weeks later. So I think one of the things I'd invite people to do is look at this 10-pager, because at the end of it, we have a series of articles I've culled from a number of places looking at some of the key forms of economic analysis, as well as some of the reports to Congress. So
I thought I just put this one up, Chris, in terms of maybe just talk us through. You mentioned Alan Shepard there, 1961. He was up there for what, 15 minutes? Blue Origin 2021, 3 minutes, and Virgin Galactic didn't quite make it up to the 50 miles.
And then we've got space jumpers, and then we have space perspectives. Yeah, here we are at the blackboard. Essentially, what is happening with the current state of the space tourism industry is essentially replicating the Alan Shepard experience. Alan Shepard was America's first astronaut in space, and his original, if you like, mission on a Redstone rocket was he went up 15 minutes. He was about 116 miles in space. What I think is going to be ultimately happening is that you're looking at an industry that's essentially building around what was the essential experience, the first actual experience of Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard.
Yeah.
That is actually what people will be buying into in terms of getting enthusiastic and interested about space. And where we go from there is a really interesting question, because what does the next iteration? I think people are too focused on the current craft that have gone up, which have proved being human rated. What we need to start thinking about is when do we start launching serious space operations? Because remember, the original economic analyses saw a potential market between 13 to 15,000 people over a 10-year period wanting to buy a ticket to go into space at roughly $200,000 per piece. More recent economic analysis from the 2018s suggests that pool could potentially be 41,000 people. Now, that has a series of consequences in terms of how we understand the growth of the space industry. The one there is another variation of this, which is actually stratospheric ballooning, which is a company called Space Perspectives. And we've also got on our blackboard previously, we had the space jumper.
Yeah. So that's an opportunity, is it? You can be a space jumper into the future?
We've had actually. There's four major records have been set since the 1950s, like 1950s, early 60s.
Yeah,
and as late as 2014. Well, what I was doing was, if you like, bringing together, because up to now we've had economic analyses of the potentiality of space tourism. What happened with both within a week, a fortnight of each other, was first the Virgin Galactic, then Jeff Bezos. Was we saw really all that 20 years finally coming together. Now, interestingly enough, there was a lot of commentary about the idea about the billionaires going into space, but it was actually interesting when you look at it, because 20 years ago, when they were first starting to think about, could we start creating a commercial space market, who else was going to step into the breach? If government wasn't going to fund this, who else would? And this is exactly what we've had really largely playing out the last 20 years. The question becomes, where do we go next? Do we have a situation where we're largely having an exclusive market to potentially to a wealthy pool who can afford this? With volume, does that begin to drop down? But the other question is ultimately, how else do we make use of this technology? And the question also we have to ask ourselves is, currently we're looking at craft Spaceship Two and New Shepard. We don't know how these technologies will progress over the next decade as these services become more routine. And I think that's the most important aspect of this, of understanding the industry. And it's in if you like, it's in its beginning stages. I mean, interestingly enough, one of the pressing issues is you asked earlier with when you're looking at that. So what was it? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The guy previously interviewing, talking about space junk.
Oh, Andy, yes.
Andy, yeah, space junk. And you asked about, well, and he actually said, well, there's no actual law about returning space junk.
Yeah.
One of the interesting points is that even in 2020, one of the congressional researchers has noted that there is actually no current regulation or legislation to do with space tourism. So, for example,
there's no limitation, right?
There's no limitation. So, for example, one of the most interesting things is with the Blue Origin mission was one of the party of four was 18 years old. And the reason why that's actually significant is that if you actually look at the average age of an astronaut, they're about 34 years old. Right. And usually they're a lot older. And we've never actually asked the question, well, how young is it to go into space? So, for example, if nations at the end would look at potentiality of, this translating to Australian circumstances, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, if countries are sort of moving towards creating the space generation, such as, for example, in China, I know it's one of the most recent developments in Shanghai is a mega space center. China also has in the Gobi Desert set up sort of replicating the experience of going to Mars, living in a human habitat, or onto the moon, living in and I think in Beijing actually there's a public facility for looking at what it would be like to be on a space facility on the moon, on a habitat. So essentially, that idea do these sorts of tourism ends up being one of the major ways in which we train people and give people that initial experience of going to space.
Well, it's almost like an Everest type thing, isn't it? Where look at the market for just getting up to Everest, where it's almost so crowded, and they're paying a lot of money. This is a good alternative, and it was one of those terms you talk about space tourism, but also the adventurism.
The adventure aspect of this, because I think the best way to characterize the industry right now is space tourism, space adventures. And against that goes back to, you can have your Alan Shepard experience. You can experience what he experienced in a truncated way. For example, there is a small train. There is, I think, with both Virgin and Blue Origin will be having short training periods to prepare people to go into space. Hence this led to the entire debate about whether they were astronauts or not. I think in one of the slides I've got there the commercial space wings.
I'll have a look, but just maybe this one, you're looking at $125,000 per seat. This is a relatively new company, Space Perspective, launched in June 2020.
Very, very interesting, because what they're looking at is, again, it goes back to the sheer diversity of going to space, edge of space. I think the best way to understand the industry right now is that there are missions which will be going to low Earth orbit, which is one of those at the end of the year, which at the end of this year, which is Inspiration 4, which is actually SpaceX. There is a mission going to stay on the International Space Station. Those are if you like, those are low Earth orbit exercises. We then have exercises going to what is called traditionally or classically the edge of space, or just over the Kremlin line.
That one there,
which is basically there. Or you have missions that are going well above commercial airlines, because if we go down to the blackboard, notice the yellow line. Commercial aviation is 7.2 miles.
Yeah, and then there's nothing in regulation after that?
Well, after that point, what we've got is we have an entirely new set of human activities occurring up to the edge of space and into space. And it's that, and what's so interesting about this is just powering along since this year. But it took 20 years to build up.
Yeah.
So, for example, the idea of a stratospheric balloon going up to 19 miles, that's doable. That's the technology that exists right now. The interesting thing is how do we start to manage, I think from a public policy point of view and an economics point of view, how do we start to manage what could be potentially large numbers of people for the first time going to space? Because on one of the tables, we find out that currently there's over about 180 professional astronauts worldwide, if you look at the various astronaut corps that exist. However, there's only 10 people actually in space right now. 7 on the International Space Station, and 3 on the Chinese space station. For within a fortnight, that population actually sort of increased by 12, between 10 and 12 people. So we actually doubled when Jeff Bezos went up in Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic, Sir Branson went up in Virgin Galactic. We actually briefly doubled the number of humans in space.
And what's some of the prices that if people start to expect, do you think? What's some of the prices likely, say, on this one with the Virgin Galactic?
Well, with the Virgin Galactic, what we do know at the moment, and this is actually rather interesting, because when you look at the original economic analyses going back to 2002 and 2018, one of the things they said there was a potential pool of about 15,000 people could potentially go up over a 10-year period. And on one of the tables, I amortized that over that period and said, say figure it, 930 people. The sort of pricing you're looking at is about $250,000 at the moment. But interestingly enough, Virgin Galactic has already a pool of pre-ticket sales, believed to be in around the 600 mark, but they have potential bookings over 8,000 already. So
at 600,000 each?
No, at about $250,000 per ticket potentially. We don't know. We don't know whether that'll go up. I mean, one of the interesting economic analyses is they see an initial ticket price, a brief rise, and then it beginning to drop off as demand increases and the service becomes more regular, which is a classic economic model. Because this is exactly, if you like, this is a space version, the edge of space version of the airline industry.
Yeah.
Now, what I think is interesting about this is that if you look at economic analyses back in the 2000s, thought it would be a pool of 15,000 people. Already we have one company which actually has a tested version. And the illustration we're looking at now is actually Spaceship Two with its mothership. This is what's called a horizontal launch system. The mothership, which is the craft on either side with a wing, is what takes it to a horizontal, takes it into the upper aerospace area. And then the Spaceship Two then detaches and then rockets up to edge of space for their space experience. What is interesting about that is that already the current calculation, as Virgin has almost achieved, is actually nearing the 15,000 mark, which the original economic analysts thought would be the case over a 10-year period. So potentially there is actually quite a demand out there. The issue which we also cover off on this paper is we then look at some of the other questions that are beginning to arise out of this, such as, for example, one of the debates that almost immediately happened, both in the case of Blue Origin, both Virgin Galactic as well as Blue Origin, when they had the post-media brief, if you like, they awarded themselves company-designed astronaut medals. Now, what was so interesting about this, virtually I think it was in the day of Blue Origin's launch and return, the FAA issued refreshed instructions as to who actually qualifies as a commercial astronaut, and they excluded both Bezos and Sir Branson and the people. And I think actually that sort of somewhat got misunderstood. And I think what was really happening there is that if you look at it, there's actually now probably about 3 to several different categories of different types of astronaut we can actually have. There is a government astronaut, as in the NASA astronaut, NASA's famous astronaut corps. There's various national astronauts from Canada, Japan, India, and China. Some of those have their own national forms of identification. China is Tigonauts, India is Guggenauts. Canada and Japan are basically standard astronaut. We've always thought of an astronaut under international law ever since the 1967 Space Treaty as anyone who goes into space. However, NASA is now talking about commercial astronauts, private astronauts, public astronauts, and space tourists.
Yeah.
So again, actually, and what was happening was why the FAA probably went the direction it did was a concern about the fact as well, how do you therefore identify someone who actually has commercial astronaut wings, which is actually a private or public astronaut who's qualified to do a space mission. And I think that is where it sort of got a bit messy and a bit confused, and people didn't quite understand some of the distinctions the FAA was beginning to set up. Admittedly, it was problematic because they're actually trying to set it up after the event has actually happened. They're almost backfilling the regulations, if you like. And I think it actually reflects again the fact is that the pace of this industry development, the pace of space development is happening so fast. It's classically the problem with all technology, the relationship between technology and law. Is technology just speeds ahead. The law is slow to always catch up, and law is often trying to categorize events that have already happened. And as soon as they categorize something new is created, and therefore the question is, how does the law actually cover that?
Well, look, it's no doubt. I'm just conscious of time, Chris. Look, we will publish this, and it's a fascinating field. Again, the fact that the two kind of owners went up first.
That actually was seen very much as part of a confidence exercise, because if they were prepared to do it themselves.
Yep.
Let's face it.
But it also.
Do you really want to send your CEO into space? Some might, some won't.
Well, I think it also comes to the type of characters that they are as well. They're competitive. They want, it is a good global exposure for them. And as you say, there's no shortage of people who are prepared or with the money prepared to do this. If it can be done safely and without limitation, then it's worthwhile doing. And I think, again, I only need to look at, say, the Everest and the adventure type market at the moment. So,
and I do want to draw one thing that's important, which is coming out of all of this, is the environmental aspects. Because this is something we really need to start thinking about in terms of, at the moment, space activity is 1% of aviation in terms of pollutants in the air. That's the exhaust from rockets. The problem at the moment, which we need to confront, is that we already have at the commercial aviation level a discernible layer of carbon emissions. It's almost what happens, and this is the environmental issue, which is beginning to become increasingly important, is what happens when we start thinking about 41,000 people going into near Earth or low Earth orbit tours. What is the volume of rocketry that's going to be happening?
Yeah.
For example, we know that commercial satellite launching is going to exponentially expand, because we talked to a number of companies who see literally thousands of satellites being launched in the under 500 category, micro and under 500 category limits. We also see large scale exercises in terms of putting actual stations into space. We know that spaceplane operations will begin shortly. Sierra Nevada Corporation's Dream Chaser. We know that the Chinese are at the moment going through the exercise of building their space station. Axiom Space is soon to start a series of launch missions next year and the next 2 years to begin preparation to build a space station on the back of the ISS. We've just seen the ISS refurbished with a completely new pressurized unit.
Yeah.
We know the Sierra Nevada Corporation is preparing to build its own space station. There is actually almost talk of SpaceX actually building a space station as well.
So I think your point is there's so much activity going on.
What fuels are we going to be burning to send us through our atmosphere?
The environment. Yeah,
what is the impact on the upper stratosphere and the mesosphere?
Yeah, as well as not just the outer atmosphere, but then we've also got our own airline sector going to be kicking off again. You'd expect by about 2024. So that's a lot of activity in the. You hardly be able to see the sun.
Well, there's a possibility. I mean, the thing is about what sort of fuels are we burning? Yeah. We're exhausting into our atmosphere, which actually lead to soot buildups and so forth. And I think the literature is pretty complicated, and it's in its early stages. But I think people really need to, if they're interested in space, this is another area they really need to actually look at, because actual fact, Paul at Black Arrow Space Technologies, Black Arrow, the entire business model of the company is actually environmentally clean.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why we're not only talking about the impact on the surface of the Earth or on the ocean in terms of the launching of a rocket, its exhaust, but what happens with that exhaust going through our atmosphere? What is it depositing in our atmosphere? And that is because at the moment, as I said, it's only 1% of activity. Well, what happens when the scale of activity begins to dramatically swing in favor of space, of going into low Earth orbit and near Earth or edge of space or suborbital, as it's correctly known?
Well, Chris, unfortunately, it
Yeah.
sounds like it's a whole episode on its own on that one. So, look, I think definitely we'll flag that one for a potential discussion into the
I
future.
think we need. I think that's actually something we need to
A
start
bit more
looking at.
analysis.
There should be environmental scientists we should be bringing in to start talking about this, because
Yeah,
I think it's an issue which actually impacts on the space industry in terms of the future development of engines and what fuels we actually put into those engines.
very good point.
And just the very last thing I want to talk about is we've also got a little one-pager on how space tourism would actually translate in the Australian set of circumstances.
Yep.
And I would invite people to have a look at that and have a look at some of the issues that have been raised out of that. But look, again, we really did we just did our half hour, didn't we?
That's it. And what I'll do is we'll have this up on the website today with a link into this particular interview. But again, there's a lot of here. You did a lot of work here, Chris. So there is a great deal of information. And as you say, is keep the audience wanting more. There's also a bit of a takeaway there on Australian space tourism adventures.
I think in
well.
October we're thinking of the exercise in October. I think this is sort of helping us also formulate what sort of topics we should be looking at in October about thinking about the Australian commercial space industry.
Very good.
Where we're going to be taking this.
Good on you. Okay, well, look, Dr. Chris Flaherty, My Space Analysis Lab, thank you so much for today. It's a really good space special. And yeah, we'll have you back on very, very soon.
All right, Chris, have a really great day.
You too,
mate.
Happy
lockdown. Happy lockdown.
Happy lockdown. All right. Thanks, Chris. I'll put you backstage, mate. Cheers.
Right.
Very good. Okay, so that's our space special for today, folks. Hopefully you've taken something out of that. And again, let me just tidy these up. And as I do, our report of the day, this one came out from, this is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. And again, this is a threat landscape for supply chain attacks. Slightly off topic from space. I might have thought to look for a space related report. But again, I just wanted to highlight this one. This was just came out, I think, 2 days ago. 24 supply chain attacks were reported from January 2020 to early July 2021 that have been studied in this report. This is available on the MySecurity Marketplace as a resource. Around 50% of the attacks were attributed and to well-known APT groups by the security community. Around 42% of the analysed attacks have not yet been attributed, so it's still quite high. Around 62% of the attacks on customers took advantage of their trust in their supplier, again, being a supply chain attack. In 62% of the cases, malware was the attack technique employed. And when considering targeted assets, in 66% of the incidents, attackers focused on the supplier's code in order to further compromise targeted customers. And around 58% of the supply chain attacks aimed at gaining access to data, predominantly customer data, including personal data and intellectual property, and around 16% at gaining access to people, which will be those sort of spear phishing access as well. So very comprehensive and in-depth report on that one. And that is the report of the day. And that is us from our Friday morning episode of Tech and Sec Weekly. Have a great weekend here in Sydney and Queensland and Melbourne. Enjoy your lockdown, stay safe, get vaccinated. But for the rest of those listening, thank you very much and have a great weekend.